August 15th, 1913. An 8-year-old boy killed a grown man with his bare hands. That boy was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. For 60 years, no one knew why. This isn't the story they put in history books. This is the story of how America's most feared gangster was born. Not in the streets of Harlem, but in a cotton field in South Carolina. Not as a criminal, but as a victim. What happened that summer day didn't just change a little boy's life. It created a monster that would rule New York for 50 years. And the truth was so dark that Bumpy took it to his grave. Most people think Bumpy Johnson was born evil. They think he chose the life of violence and crime. But the truth is more horrible than anyone imagined. Evil wasn't something Bumpy chose. Evil was something that chose him. To understand what happened, you need to understand South Carolina in 1913. This wasn't just the American South. This was the heart of darkness. Jim Crow laws weren't just rules. They were licenses to kill. Black children weren't seen as children. They were seen as future threats that needed to be eliminated. Charleston County was cotton country. Endless fields worked by black families who were free in name only. The Civil War had ended slavery, but it hadn't ended the system. It had just changed the paperwork. Instead of slaves, they were called sharecroppers, but the whips were still real. The fear was still real. The death was still real. The Johnson family worked the Hartwell plantation, 3,000 acres of cotton owned by Thomas Hartwell, a man whose grandfather had owned 200 slaves before the war. Thomas still thought he owned people. He just couldn't say it out loud anymore. Margaret Moultrie Johnson was 28 years old, mother of 4 children, working 16-hour days in the cotton fields. Her husband William kept his head down because that's how black men survived in 1913 South Carolina. Their oldest son Willie was 15, strong enough to work like a man, smart enough to know what that meant in the South. And then there was Ellsworth, 8 years old, skinny because food was scarce, quiet because children learned early that noise could be dangerous, different because of the bump on the back of his head, a birth defect that other children mocked and adults found unsettling. The other plantation workers called him Bumpy because of that growth on his skull. But there was something else different about this boy, something in his eyes. He watched everything, remembered everything, understood things that children weren't supposed to understand. He understood that his mother came home with bruises that didn't come from cotton picking. He understood why his father sat on the porch at night, staring into darkness, hands clenched into fists that would never be used. He understood that his brother Willie was growing into the kind of man that Thomas Hartwell would eventually see as a threat. What Bumpy didn't understand yet was that he was already seen as a threat too. August 15th, 1913. The cotton was ready for harvest, which meant 18-hour days for everyone old enough to hold a sack. The temperature was 97 degrees by noon. Children as young as 6 worked alongside their parents because every hand meant more money, and every penny meant survival. Bumpy was working his mother's row, filling his small sack with cotton bolls, when he heard the shouting. Not the normal shouting of foremen pushing workers. Different shouting, angry shouting, dangerous shouting. Thomas Hartwell was in the field, which was unusual. The owner rarely came down from his big house to supervise directly. But today, he was there, red-faced and furious, screaming at someone near the far edge of the cotton rows. Bumpy dropped his sack and moved closer, using the tall cotton plants as cover. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. Willie Johnson was on his knees in the dirt. Thomas Hartwell stood over him, holding a leather whip. But this wasn't about work performance. This was about something else entirely. You looked at her. Hartwell was screaming. "Don't you deny it, boy? My daughter saw you looking at her yesterday when she rode past. You think you can look at a white woman like that? You think you have that right?" Willie's voice was barely a whisper. "No, sir. I didn't mean nothing by it. I was just working, and she rode past, and I looked up for a second. That's all." But Thomas Hartwell was beyond reason. This wasn't about what Willie had done. This was about what Willie represented, a black teenager who was growing into a man. In 1913 South Carolina, that was a crime that had only one punishment: My grandfather would have cut your eyes out for looking at a white woman, Hartwell snarled. But I'm more civilized than that. I'm just going to beat some respect into you. The first lash caught Willie across the shoulders, tearing through his work shirt like paper. Willie bit his lip to keep from screaming, but blood ran down his chin where his teeth broke the skin. 8-year-old Bumpy Johnson watched his brother being tortured for the crime of having eyes. The second lash, the third. By the fifth lash, Willie was unconscious, slumped forward in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. But Thomas Hartwell wasn't finished. "Maybe this will teach all of you to remember your place," Hartwell announced to the other workers who had been forced to stop and watch. "Maybe this will remind you what you are." That's when Bumpy saw what Hartwell was really planning to do. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a straight razor. This wasn't just a beating. This was going to be a murder. A public execution designed to terrorize every black family on the plantation. In that moment, something broke inside 8-year-old Ellsworth Johnson. Not his spirit, his humanity. Bumpy picked up a cotton hoe from the ground. It was almost as tall as he was, with a heavy iron blade designed to chop through tough roots and hard soil. He walked up behind Thomas Hartwell while the man was opening the razor. "Mr. Hartwell," Bumpy said quietly. Thomas Hartwell turned around, surprised to find a child standing so close to him. "What do you want, boy? Get back to work before I—" Bumpy drove the hoe blade into Thomas Hartwell's stomach with every ounce of strength in his 8-year-old body. The plantation owner looked down in shock at the iron blade buried in his gut. Blood spread across his white shirt like spilled paint. He dropped the razor and staggered backward, hands clutching the handle of the hoe. "You!" Hartwell gasped. "You little—" But he never finished the sentence. He fell backward into the cotton plants and died with his eyes open, staring at the South Carolina sky. 47 workers witnessed an 8-year-old boy kill a white plantation owner. In 1913, South Carolina, that was signing all their death warrants. Every black person on that plantation would be lynched before sunset if anyone reported what they'd seen. But something miraculous happened. Something that showed the difference between justice and law. One by one, the workers began to move. They picked up their cotton sacks. They returned to their rows. They continued harvesting as if nothing had happened, as if Thomas Hartwell had simply vanished into thin air. Nobody spoke about what they'd seen. Nobody would ever speak about it. William Johnson picked up his unconscious son Willie and carried him home. Margaret Johnson took Bumpy's blood-stained hand and walked him back to their cabin. The other workers spread out across the field, and by evening they had picked more cotton than any single day in plantation history. When Thomas Hartwell's wife came looking for her husband at dinner time, the field foreman told her he'd ridden into Charleston on business. When he didn't return the next day, they organized a search party. They found his horse by the river, saddled but riderless. The assumption was that he'd been thrown and drowned. His body was never found. What happened that night in the Johnson cabin changed everything. Willie survived his beating, but barely. The infection from his wounds kept him bedridden for 2 months. The family couldn't afford a doctor, so Margaret nursed him with home remedies and prayer. But it was Bumpy who worried her most. The boy who had killed a man at age 8 didn't cry, didn't have nightmares, didn't seem traumatized by what he'd done. Instead, he seemed to understand something that terrified his mother. He'd learned that violence was the only language that power understood. He'd learned that sometimes killing was not only justified, it was necessary. And he'd learned that he was very, very good at it. "You can't ever tell anyone what happened," Margaret told her youngest son as they sat by Willie's sickbed. "Not ever. Not even when you're old. Not even when I'm dead. You understand?" Bumpy nodded. "I understand, Mama." "What you did," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face, "it was brave. It was right. But the world isn't ready for right. The world would kill all of us if they knew. Promise me you'll never be that angry again. Promise me you'll find another way." But Bumpy couldn't promise that, because in that cotton field, he'd discovered something about himself that couldn't be undone. He'd discovered that he was capable of doing what other people couldn't do. And in 1913, South Carolina, that was the most dangerous discovery a black child could make. 6 months later, the Johnson family left South Carolina forever. They told people they were moving north for better opportunities, which wasn't entirely a lie, but the real reason was that Margaret was afraid of what might happen when Willie was fully recovered, and the rage over his beating finally surfaced. More than that, she was afraid of what Bumpy might become if he stayed in a place where white men could torture his family without consequences. The family packed everything they owned into 2 suitcases and took the train to New York City. Willie found work in the stockyards. William found work in construction. Margaret found work cleaning houses for wealthy white families. And Bumpy found the streets of Harlem. But he brought something with him from that cotton field in South Carolina. A coldness that couldn't be warmed. A capacity for violence that couldn't be civilized. And an understanding that in this world, respect wasn't given to the righteous, it was taken by the ruthless. By age 10, Bumpy was running numbers for local hustlers. By age 12, he was collecting debts for policy bankers. By age 15, he'd killed his second man. By age 20, the streets of Harlem knew his name and feared it. But none of them knew the real origin story. None of them knew about the 8-year-old boy who'd killed a plantation owner to save his brother. None of them knew that America's most feared gangster had been created by America's most shameful legacy. That secret stayed buried for 60 years, through Bumpy's rise to power in Harlem, through his wars with Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano, through his friendship with Malcolm X, through 11 years in Alcatraz and his dramatic comeback. Bumpy Johnson never told anyone about that day in the cotton field. Not his wife Mamie, who knew all his other secrets, not his closest associates, not even Malcolm X, who would have understood better than anyone else what it meant to be shaped by white violence. The secret only came out in 1987, 19 years after Bumpy's death. A South Carolina historian named Dr. James Mackenzie was researching plantation records when he discovered something strange in the Hartwell family papers. Thomas Hartwell had apparently vanished on August 15, 1913, the same day that the Johnson family abruptly left the plantation. Dr. Mackenzie found that the Johnson family had arrived in New York with more money than sharecroppers should have possessed. But the final piece of evidence came from Sarah Washington, 94 years old, the last surviving witness. "I was 12 years old that day," she told Dr. Mackenzie. "I saw what that white man did to Willie Johnson, and I saw what little Bumpy did back to him. We all swore we'd never tell, but everybody's dead now except me, and I think the truth ought to be known." The workers on the plantation had taken up a collection to help the Johnson family escape before anyone discovered Hartwell's body. "That little boy saved all our lives that day," Sarah Washington said. "Thomas Hartwell would have killed Willie, and then he would have killed any of us who complained about it." But she also revealed something else that explained why Bumpy became what he became. After he killed that man, little Bumpy was different. Before that day, he was just a quiet child who minded his business, but afterward, he looked at people like he was calculating whether they deserved to live or die. The truth explains everything about Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson that historians could never understand: why he was so protective of children in Harlem, why he never hesitated to use violence against people he saw as predators, why he could be utterly ruthless to his enemies, but generous and loyal to his friends, why he spent his entire life trying to protect his community from the kind of evil he'd encountered in that South Carolina cotton field. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born a killer. He was created by a system that gave him only 2 choices: become a victim or become a predator. At age 8, he made his choice, and he spent the next 60 years living with the consequences. The bump on his head that gave him his nickname? That wasn't just a birth defect. It was the physical manifestation of the damage that system had done to him, a permanent reminder of what America had turned him into. Every time someone called him Bumpy, they were saying the name of a boy who had been forced to become a killer before he was old enough to understand what killing meant. This is the real origin story of Bumpy Johnson, not the romanticized version that Hollywood prefers, where criminals are born bad and choose their fate. The true story, where evil creates evil and trauma shapes destiny, where an 8-year-old boy learned that in America, black children don't get to be children. They get to be targets or weapons, and Bumpy Johnson chose to be a weapon. That choice saved his brother's life. It saved his family's life. It probably saved dozens of other lives that day and in the years that followed, but it also created one of America's most feared criminals, and the weight of that choice shaped every decision Bumpy made for the rest of his life. The truth about that day in South Carolina stayed buried for 60 years because the people who knew it understood something important. Some secrets are too dangerous to tell. Some truths are too painful to face. But now you know. Now you understand why Bumpy Johnson became what he became, and why, despite everything he did in his criminal career, that 8-year-old boy in the cotton field might have been the hero of his own story. If this story of trauma, survival, and the making of a legend moved you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that heroes and villains aren't born. They're made by the choices society forces them to make. And in the comments, let me know, was 8-year-old Bumpy Johnson a murderer or a protector? Next week, we're revealing the secret FBI file on Bumpy's childhood that the government tried to hide for 50 years. You won't want to miss that.